Hello and welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight's session is an open session, so if there is anything specific you have questions about, completely unrelated to the topic, this is one of those sessions where go ahead and ask that question. We'll try and address it. If it's one of those topics that could take an hour to explain, we might delay you and say, let's have an individual session on that. Okay. That said, I want to apologize in advance for my dogs barking, because they're going to bark because it's 4th of July weekend, right? So we've got fireworks, and they love fireworks. So the topic, once again, sorry, I forgot to do image of the week. Keep posting them, though, because I need a few images to pick from. I didn't see many get posted this past week. Okay, milestones. What am I talking about, milestones? It seems like every astrophotographer kind of goes through those same, I'll call them milestones, maybe they're stepping stones, things you have to overcome to progress in your astro imaging. And as a beginner, we've all kind of gone through those same steps. At first, probably many of you started out just like me. How do I attach the camera to the telescope? Okay, I figured it out. I bought the adapter. It's attached. 5-second exposure, 10-second exposure, pushing those exposures longer and longer, because in most cases, when you're first starting out, that exposure length is what you're trying to push up. You want to see how long you can expose and keep your stars round. Sure, we could put the camera on there and do trigger a 5-second exposure, but as a beginner, possibly using the wrong equipment, possibly using an SCT on an alt-az mount, you're going to quickly discover that it's not going to work out. You don't just pick the exposure length. You have to feel out your equipment, and you have to see how long you can expose for before the stars begin to get oblong. So that first milestone that kind of triggered in my mind was, what have I accomplished? Was when I hit that 5 to 8 minute exposure mark. I was using a DSLR, so the camera could handle exposures of that length. When I was in darker skies or using a light pollution filter. But basically, hitting 5-minute exposures with that filter, that's when I'm going to say I took that step from being a beginner to being able to get good data that was good enough to process. And it's not going to necessarily be the data that's holding me back. In some senses it will be, but once you have round stars and a good signal to noise ratio on your subs, you can work with that. So I do think that that 5-minute point, when I hit that, I was basically happy with my progression. For me, that coincided with basically figuring out my alt-azimuth mount, my CPC 800, on my newly introduced Celestron wedge, was basically rigid enough to take a system not quite designed for astrophotography and give me nice stable exposures. At the time, I was using a piggybacked guide scope, and that I was happy with that. But as we all kind of figure out, we want to push things. And I discovered that 5-minute exposures, I was getting round stars. 8-minute exposures, though, I wasn't. And I couldn't quite figure out what the problem was. After trying and trying and trying, I was basically fed up with my mount and system. And I knew I was going to be upgrading. But I did figure out what my issue was. And that was mirror shift within my SCT. But it wasn't that the mirror was shifting, causing my exposures to go bad. It was that I was piggyback guiding, and my mirror was shifting slightly. So it was causing some differential flexure between my guide camera and my imaging camera. And that's why the oblongation showed up in 8 minutes, but not 5 minutes. 5 minutes wasn't long enough for that mirror to shift and the guiding to correct, but 8 minutes basically gave it enough time to shift. It happened more in certain parts of the sky, but it was all based on the gravity of the mirror, the gravity on the mirror. So at about the same time, I was fed up with my system to begin with, because I knew at that point I really enjoyed astrophotography and I wanted a specific astrophotography system. So I did get an astrophysics mount, and I went from, I got the astrophysics mount, knew that piggyback guiding was my issue and I was going to have to get an off-axis guider, so used it for about 2 weeks before getting the off-axis guider. And the combination of getting the mount and the off-axis guider fixed all of my problems. And basically, whereas my 5-minute milestone was my beginner milestone, the point where I said I'm good enough to get good data, this was the point where I basically thought that the data is only, I'm as good as my exposure, my overall exposure lengths. I could take 30-minute narrowband exposures, 1-hour narrowband exposures. My equipment was no longer limiting me. And that milestone, when it comes to acquisition, is basically a big one. And I don't think everyone hits that easily. But that's the point where you can basically completely think about full automation, because you want to acquire as much data as possible. Your acquisition is good enough. You're going to have a lot of data coming in to work on your processing. So I think that's, when it comes to acquisition, those are the milestones to me that stand out. Why am I talking about exposure length and acquisition when it comes to milestones? Well, because you're going to learn different pieces of software, but you can always go back and reprocess stuff. Having that good, solid data to begin with, right off the bat, those are the things you have to aim for. I say right off the bat, not having to struggle with your equipment when you go out each night. Just basically getting to the point where you say, my system as it stands is bulletproof. The complexity now that I'm going to add is automation. The complexity now that I'm going to add is going to make it acquire more data for me faster, more efficiently. And then I would say number two, milestone is that full.
Adam.
Yes.
I have a quick question for you or maybe to the forum. What do you feel the dividing line between finder scope and off-axis guider? At what focal length or what image scale is it okay to use a finder scope, and at what focal length or image scale do you kind of off-axis guider becomes a must?
All right, so other people with different experiences can definitely comment.
I'll say my answer after you guys.
Okay.
I think.
But what I'll say is, first of all, the SCT is notoriously difficult for a couple reasons. First, it's long focal length, right? So you're pushing the focal length. That's a complexity. Also, the mirror is always going to shift a little bit. There are techniques, and in fact, Adam's posting right now a trick that he learned. So you basically flip the meridian, and the assumption is that the mirror is like sitting there waiting to kind of get that extra little bump, and you push it all the way over the meridian, so that basically I'm going to say the telescope's kind of upside down. So you're basically causing it to flop. Then you bring it back, and as you go back, you're going back over the same path that you caused it to pre-flop. I do not know if that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But there are small techniques, but the SCT adds that level of complexity. With a dual refractor setup and good rings, I would have no issues basically using a guide scope. You need a good focuser too. I used a William Optics. I think it was a 60 a William Optics 66. I forget the designation of it. And the focuser was good enough to put my guide camera in and let that do it. But when I put my DSLR on it, my DSLR actually sagged it. So you do need a solid focuser. But if you're using a non-mirrored setup, I think you're a lot more likely to be able to succeed with with a piggyback scope. Side by sides have been known to cause issues because as they go up, as they kind of follow, track across the sky, the gravity impacts them slightly separately. But those are my words of wisdom. Anyone else in the room comment on their experiences? If not, Tolga, I guess we'd be glad to hear your experience.
Well, I say, this is, of course, this is not a solid line. Everybody's going to be a little bit different. But my experience is 1,000 millimeters.
Mm-hmm.
Anything below, like if you're using like an FSQ at f5, in that case, I think a finder guider scope works. But once you go over 1,000 millimeter and below 1 arcsecond image scale, I think the finder scope, the off-axis guider becomes a must. That's the way I feel, and that's been my experience. Maybe some other people may have had better experiences with a finder scope, guide scopes at beyond, 1,000 millimeter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for a very wide field setup, it is it's nice to have that simple, no worries about kind of getting your off-axis guiders are difficult, right? That said, when I did my wide field setup, the one thing that I wanted, this is a William Optics Star, what is it, Star 60, 68 or whatever it is, 67. One requirement I had was that I could use my off-axis guider on it because I wanted to easily be able to just take my CCD camera off with the integrated off-axis guider and put it onto that scope. And that's actually difficult to find or was difficult to find, was a super wide field scope that could handle the back focus of that off-axis guider. And it works well.
Yeah, that all being said, if what you have available to you is a refractor and you don't want to invest in the complexity of an off-axis guider yet, or the more sensitive camera you need to do that, I have gotten away with using as short as a 400 millimeter refractor on my C11. Now, when I have a focal reducer on it to bring it down to f6.3, which reduces it to like 1,700 millimeters, I have gotten as long as 10 minutes on it before. But even sometimes when I accidentally forgot to put the focal reducer on there, I have gotten away with at least 5 minutes. I think maybe a little bit longer at f10 as well, at the full focal length. So it is possible to do. If you already have a refractor available to you, maybe a refractor you used to image with, and then now you've got an STT or whatever. But the refractor was that Orion short tube was given to me, so I had it already available. But yeah, so it can be done. It can be done.
Yeah, and in theory, the guiding programs can handle much shorter focal length on the guide scope than the imaging scope. I've
got an Orion 50 millimeter, one of those mini guiders that has a focal length of like 152 millimeters or something. And their website claims, I haven't tested this, but they claim that you can guide something as long as 1,500 millimeters with that little tiny guider. I've had a lot of success using it with like short focal length refractors and stuff, but they say it can go up to 1,500 millimeters. That'd be interesting to try at some point, because that's a really compact and cheap guide system.
Yep. One of the things I will say is I think that some of those smaller guide scopes, the not immediately seen benefit of them is they're lightweight. So they don't require really expensive, massive mountings, right?
Yeah, I kind of want to try it with like, so I have my 8-inch Schmidt Cassegrain that I want to try on my Celestron AVX mount, which I think if I put a guide scope on the top might push it a little bit far into the weight limit of the AVX. But if I put a focal reducer on my C8, that brings it down to like 1200 millimeters. And I'd be curious to try using that little guider on there, because then it doesn't add any weight and you don't have the flexure issues of like a ring-based refractor, because it's on there with like a teleview, one of those like the same one you attach the finder scopes to, or yeah. So that's one of my other upcoming experiments, is to see if that would work. But yeah, I think they could be them being lightweight could be good for a lot of people's systems, especially if they have lower end mounts.
Mm-hmm. And I never want to discourage people from not trying what you have. The most important thing is that you get out with what you have. And even if you have an unsuccessful night, you're going to learn something. Adam's pointing out, lesson learned is that the whole guiding issue teaches you that the mount is the most important thing, not the optics. The mount does all the work. The mount is the brains, and the mount has to smoothly track through the sky while responding to slight guide corrections. The better the mount, the fewer corrections should be required, and the best way to fix an issue is to not have the issue in the first place. Yeah, if you're trying to use a refractor, a wide field refractor piggybacked on any sort of system, you want to rule out other issues. Make sure your PEC is trained. Make sure your mount is well polar aligned. You know, if your mount isn't well polar aligned, if you're not confident in your polar alignment, then that's going to cause issues. That is immediately what we may not even take that into consideration when we see some sort of issue in your image, but it's probably going to be one of the most common newcomer issues. If you are using a wide field guide scope and you are mispolar aligned, you're usually gonna see field rotation around the guide star, right? If you're mispolar aligned with a off-axis guider, you tend to just see elongated stars, so it kind of turns up a little bit differently. That said, if you're not comfortable in your polar alignment routine, don't look at better gear. Don't look at an off-axis guider. Work on your polar alignment. These days, there's actually some good gear out there. What is the polar alignment camera? I'm forgetting. Polemaster. Yes. Basically, 5 to 10 minute perfect polar alignment just by following a routine and a program, and more accurate than a lot of the routines that a lot of us rely on. So it's not as hard. It's not as difficult as it used to be. Yeah, the difficulty for off-axis guiders is the spacing. Particularly if you're switching between field flatteners or scopes for that matter, you're going to have a number of different spacers. Basically, I just try and remember which spacers I use for my large scope and then which spacers I use for my small scope. I kind of keep them pre-set up and pre-configured on the scopes and then store them that way so that I don't have to think about it every single time. But it's definitely a something you want to pre-plan before you buy that off-axis guider. So any other topics in the room? Anything you guys want to talk about? Any milestones, sticking to the rough general topic of tonight?
I think, right, Adam just said that too. Going from a DSLR to a CCD. I don't know if that's what he meant, but I think that's a milestone.
That 16-bit milestone is what he posted. Yeah, I don't know. Could be, trying to think. Not exactly. 16-bit. Okay, I think we're off on that one. Yeah, I didn't know whether it was migration to PixInsight, right? Because all of a sudden you're working on your photos, on your images at a higher bit depth. But
I think, Adam, that even though it's not a mechanical or an optical milestone, I think PixInsight has become a milestone for us. I know it's changed my processing completely, and I think everyone here has had the same experience, whereas 3 years ago, it was virtually unknown. And not only that, but when we tried it out, it was such a puzzling program, you know, we kind of gave up until we finally got it. That has certainly been a milestone in my production of images, no doubt about it.
Yep. Yeah, and he's elaborating. He's saying display issue, more brightnesses than can be displayed on the screen at any one time, which basically, yeah, going from 8-bit to 16-bit, there's more data in that image. And bringing that over to what Eric just said, PixInsight, one of the reasons a lot of us like PixInsight is it allows us to take advantage a bit more of that data that's in there.
Yeah, Michael. The 32-bit thing that the PixInsight does. Do you guys see a difference between the 32-bit files that PixInsight saves versus the 16-bit?
I'm sorry, what's your question, Tolga?
The PixInsight saves the files at 32-bit, and then when you convert to 16-bit to go to Photoshop, are you losing anything on that?
Sometimes what I do is I'll save out 32-bit file from Deep Sky Stacker because I'm still using that, and Photoshop can do the histogram stretching at least in 32-bit. And most other functions are limited to 16-bit, but you can do your initial stretch at 32-bit. So I was doing that, converting to 16-bit, and then continuing to stretch. And I haven't noticed a really much difference at all between starting with a 32-bit and starting with a 16-bit, but I haven't really done like an exhaustive signal to noise ratio study of comparing those two. But just offhand, I haven't really noticed a great deal of difference between starting with 32-bit and starting with 16-bit when porting it into Photoshop.
I seem to remember David saying that it would become more beneficial, higher bit depths with more data, right? So if you have more subs, it may benefit you to have that higher bit depth. Whereas if you have fewer subs, you might not hit the threshold where it really benefits you a lot. And I may have that wrong, but I'm not quite sure. We'll take the antidote, Adam. Definitely.
So this was something that was very simple. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
So the anecdote is, and it's something that I think about when I think about real beginners, and this would be a milestone. It may actually happen on the first or second night. Oftentimes people will take a picture of something in the sky that they might consider easy, such as the moon or Jupiter. I mean, this is the real first time at the telescope using a camera. And the irony is, unfortunately, those particular objects are actually kind of difficult because they're so bright. And what I have experienced many times before is that a beginner will take a picture of something like Jupiter and expect on the screen to see a picture of Jupiter because they just spent the next 10 minutes trying to focus the telescope. And they think they're in focus because they focused on some stars. They go to Jupiter, and no matter what they do, they get a big white blob on the screen. It looks as if it is out of focus. In seemingly no exposure time are they able to choose that will show Jupiter. It continues to look overexposed on the screen. Of course, it isn't overexposed. The issue is that when they finally get to the 0.1 seconds or whatever it is, It's just the display. It's how the screen stretch is being displayed. And the lesson is that there is more data in an image than you can display on the screen at any one time. And choosing the screen stretch itself is an important skill for a beginning astrophotographer. That's the anecdote. And it's a big milestone to understand that what you see on the screen at any time is only a fraction of what the data potentially holds. Of course, this is an idea that extends well into image processing in terms of what potential there is that you want to do in terms of rendering your image and what you're actually seeing on the screen.
Yeah. And that basically becomes the core of what we do once we have our good data, is we're trying to bring out as much of the detail that is hidden within it. In fact, a lot of part of the reason I think a lot of us were driven to PixInsight were for a few specific tools that I think helped us to do that. The HDRMT, I want to say TGV noise, but it's not TGV. Transform I'm sorry, it's escaping me now, but there are a number of tools within PixInsight that helps you to basically display a lot more, MLT, MMT, basically display a lot more of the dynamic range in the image, or help you visualize a lot more of the dynamic range. You know, there's, as we demonstrated, or as we discussed last week, targets like the Orion Nebula are very, very bright in the center, requiring multiple exposure times. One maybe 5 second, and then maybe a 5 minute image, or I should say multiple 5 second and then multiple 5 minute images. But there are other objects, possibly like the Andromeda Galaxy, where you can get away with using one exposure length, but then you're going to need to use tools to display in a nice fashion the both extended outer region, which is really dim, and that inner region, which really has some nice dark dust clouds surrounding it. You want to be able to bring both of those out, and you'll still use masks. You'll still do it a similar way, but multi-scale linear transform, a number of PixInsight tools really will help you to do that.
Well, in this case, I'd learned not pay too much attention to the raw data that's coming out of the camera. You know, I'll run it through like subframe selector and, you know, look at the numbers of the data instead of looking at it visually, because I realized that's exactly what, you know, what we're talking about. It just doesn't represent, the screen doesn't represent what there is in the data.
Hmm. That actually kind of reminded me of a milestone that I'm not going to say the opposite of what you were saying, because I'm sure you actually follow this, but a milestone that is easy to overcome, and all you have to do is say, well, okay, I'm going to start doing that. Do not stack every sub you've taken into your image. Scrutinize every sub. If you need to use tools on it, use tools on it. PixInsight will let you basically develop an algorithm to reject certain subs based on full width half max. There's actually a number of different ways that you could do it, but start rejecting some of the worst subs, and you can work more for basically if the seeing got worse for a couple hours or for an evening, you throw those away. You'll get better detail in your final results. You might be giving up a little bit of noise reduction, but it's always a balance. But basically, if you're going for detail, you want to use the subs from those clear, still nights. If you've got a night where the conditions aren't great, maybe take your RGB and wait for a good night to take your luminance, or try and plan your sessions in a way that you are taking advantage of the conditions.
Right. The tool you're talking about is the subframe selector and what can come from that. In addition, remember the algorithm that David posted a while back, the spreadsheet that allowed you to weight those subframes. So not only can you select the ones you want to use, reject those you don't, but you can weight them according to SNR, full width, half max, or some combination of the subframe selector parameters.
Yep. Yeah, and his algorithm was basically designed to take as much advantage of all of the subs as possible. I don't know, I think a lot of us had been using that.
Yeah, maybe we should make a note and post that again. It's been a while since that was up there. I think people might have forgotten about it and want to use it. It's a very useful tool.
But after you do the subframe selector, you should blink through, right? Visually, make sure.
You should blink through to begin with, start with, then do your subframe selector, then do your weighting, and then do your stacking.
Yeah, I usually start by blinking. Through, and then do the subframe selector, because basically I'm somewhere between. If I can't see it, then it's probably good enough to the point where if I need a computer to tell me there's something wrong with it, then maybe it's okay. But that said, try it both ways and see.
Eric, when you've gotten your subframe selector and you've ranked everything, do you, okay, they're ranked. Now, how do you decide what your cutoff point is?
You know, it's interesting, and it depends on the object that you're going after, your target, how high up in the sky it goes. For example, I might decide that anything with a full width half max less than 3 is fine, but some other target doesn't get up very high. I might take something as high as, say, 3.5. It just depends on the data. But weighting takes care of a lot of the other issues, like using frames that aren't necessarily ideal. As far as blinking through, if you don't blink through, you can end up getting something with a nice high SNR that is really a jet going right through your image, and mistakenly pull that forward, and you'll see it when you start stacking. But it depends on the target. I mean, it varies by target. Generally speaking, though, I want to have a full width half max in our setup of between 1.8 and 3 at the max.
Let me ask you what you think of this particular philosophy. You rank them and you've got them sitting there, and you look down and like it runs something like 90, 90, 90, 90, 88, 87, 86, 60, 30, 40, 20. It seems to me that I'll go for as long as they're all consistently high, and then when there starts to be a gap between there and the next one, from that point on, I cut them out.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we end up running 2 or 3 different stacks, compare the results, and see what you like. I mean, there is no firm and fast rule. Depends on your telescope, your camera, and a lot of other things. I've just told you what we're doing now with our current setup at the SRO. But yeah, if it works, if your final image comes out to what you like, then go for it.
Also, if you're following, for those of us who can get into the room and can follow along, Adam Block has pointed out, be careful just how many frames you reject. Adam, if you're in the room, you want to speak up to that point? Turn your mic back on, et cetera.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I agree that, I mean, all the things that you've said are very important. One of the things, though, that's often not taken in.
Oh, did we lose his audio? I think we lost your audio for a sec. We'll have to figure out exactly what happened.
Rid of a lot of. Let me know if you can hear me.
We can hear you now.
Okay. So what I was saying is that the points that were made are right on topic. The thing that is often not considered is that statistical rejection will get rid of many problems that people will often completely throw away a frame for. Poor tracking, for example, if it's a well-guided exposure, but then something happens 15 minutes in or 10 minutes in and you had a 15-minute exposure, you can still use that frame as long as it didn't happen every single time. Because rejection will take care of all the extra scattered garbage that happened after it lost the star. So the point about being careful is that in addition to identifying it in the ways in which you've considered with the subframe analysis, and then also just by visually looking at it, also take into account how the statistics will actually reject things for you, can still use frames that, I'll give you an example. In my case, sometimes moths land on the filter, or at least on front of the camera that I was using, and it's terrible, but it was only for 2 frames out of 15. So I could still use it. People would normally throw that away.
I've often used frames that have a satellite going through them. I've even used
Absolutely.
frames with an
Do
airplane
not
through
throw
them.
away satellite frames. Don't
Yeah,
do
I
that.
just use instead of like a like an average algorithm, you use like a DSS, you use a kappa sigma clipping, and that will reject anything that's weird in the image, like satellites and airplanes and stuff. So I still am able to use those frames almost every time.
You know, you have to be careful on your rejection parameters, that you can't end up rejecting information that will degrade your image. You can get rid of satellites very well. The more frames you have, the better off you are getting rid of those. You can't get rid of a 747 going through your satellite, or some bright meteor that explodes over it. But yeah, generally you can. What can be really disappointing is you include some of those less than perfect frames, and you get your stacked image, and all of a sudden, oh yeah, there it is. That subtle little streak going through that on the frame you should have rejected. In which case, you go back and do it again and get rid of that frame, and do another stack.
Or you use the healing brush tool.
Yeah, right. Or you use the healing brush too.
I don't know. There are certain regions of the sky where you can almost guarantee you're going to get a ton of satellites. And if you start, the way I look at it is, I'm reviewing my frames as they come in. A satellite goes through it. I'm not throwing away the frame. It means I'm probably going to end up taking 3 more frames. And if I was shooting for 20, 30-minute subs, then maybe I'll take 23, 30-minute subs, get the signal-to-noise ratio a little bit better, and give it a little bit more stuff to work with to reject those satellite trails. But I find with PixInsight, 16 to 20 subs, you can basically reject any sort of satellite trail or anything like that. It seems to be enough, in my experience.
You mean if you have 16 or 20 subs, the math will work out that the satellite trail disappears?
Yes, yes.
Okay, not that if you have 16 to 20, you can afford to completely throw out that sub.
No, I would include the sub and stack it, and almost certainly wouldn't be able to see it.
But
all of my Orion images have a satellite goes, for me, I don't know if it's my right location, but satellites go through the Orion Nebula for me about once every half an hour, it seems. Yes. And I keep all of those, and I don't think I've ever had one show up in a final image.
So Molly, that's not your location. That has to do with the fact that all the geostationary satellites are at about that place in the sky from our position on the Earth, if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, which I'm assuming you are. So everyone gets that, by the way.
Yeah, it's true. I guess the ones that are at that altitude are going to be at that altitude for everyone.
Exactly.
Yep. The added difficulty of shooting Orion.
One thing to do, though, Adam, if I can butt in here, after you've stacked it, stretch it extremely and make sure that your software did its job and got rid of that streak. Sometimes it doesn't. Before you go to a lot more work to do something else, just do a really crazy extreme stretch to start with.
Yeah. And, we talked about pixel rejection and stacking, not throwing away too many subs and this and that. And what I will say is my routine in PixInsight is to throw all of my subs into batch pre-processing script at first, possibly before I'm before the point when I'm done. Maybe I only have 1 night of data. Maybe I only have 2 nights of data, and I know I want like 5 or 6. I will still throw all of the data into there, let it calibrate and register it, and blink through those. So, or at least blink through the calibrated data. And in some cases, use the calibrated data in subframe selector so that I can see which may have issues and may not. But that will spit out masters that I can compare to the images that I'm working on, that I'm trying to make look better than the master by rejecting certain subs. And I always have that master as basically the control. This is what it's like if I don't worry about anything and don't just kind of plug it in there. And then my ones when I start going in manually and trying to stack them, that is what I compare to. And it gives me a nice way to get an idea of the quality of the data I'm bringing in.
It just points out the power of that, not only the subframe selector, but that pre-processing script. I mean, it can be used for a lot of different things, just what you were doing. I think I always run through that first, whether I use the master or whether I use the calibrated frames for some other purpose or do drizzle integration. It's always a good thing to run through it to see where you are going to end up, at least approximately.
Alex is saying that he witnessed, I believe in person, Adam Block not rejecting a sub that most of them would have because a dust mode had shifted. Ooh, a shifted dust mode. That drives me nuts. Those are actually, I don't know why, I've had more difficulty with shifted dust motes than I've had with satellite trails. And I wonder why that is. Maybe because the dust mote just doesn't have that much range to it, and the satellite trail does. It would be easier for the rejection algorithm to reject the satellite trail. I'm not quite sure. But yeah, those shifting dust motes, they're terrible. For my first imaging session with my CCD camera, I had a dust mote that shifted, and I thought I thought I screwed up big time. I've got a brand new, really expensive camera that I cannot get to take images, and the second image that I took was brilliant in my opinion. So I was very happy at that point. First image, not so much. Adam's saying that, and I will introduce it now. Adam Block will be presenting for us. I believe it's July 22nd. I'm going to confirm on that. But he'll be presenting. What is that? 3 weeks from now. And during his presentation, he'll give us some tips on actually removing those dust motes and possibly using a selective rejection. The use of selective rejection in PixInsight. So that will be a good one to look forward to. I was planning on making this a shorter session. Lots of milestones we've kind of discussed, and it kind of also took its own direction. Bit more info on satellites here, so I'm just reading through that. Sorry, but yeah, I do want to thank you guys for coming. Next week, no specific topic. So something, if we get a topic, will be posted midweek. If not, I'll post an open discussion or some sort of something, some sort of placeholder later in the week. And that's basically all I've got for tonight. Thank you all for watching. I hope you guys are keeping cool because it is 1,000,000 degrees here. I think it's 1,000,000 degrees everywhere, at least in this part of the country. But yeah, thank you guys all for coming. Have a good night. See you next week.